Hello, everybody. This is the first Wednesday in June. It is June 3rd, folks. And so that means I have the privilege of having my great and good friend Lou D'Alessandro be with me here in the studio, as he is on the first Wednesday of every month, pretty much all the time. And that's a real treat to have him here. And I had thought we might have a show that would talk about what might be happening in our elections in this state. Everybody knows we're in a pandemic. We're all living it. We all understand it. We are, we've got our masks. We've got our sanitizer. We're keeping our social distancing. At least I hope we all are. A little bit of a question about that with the protests here in New Hampshire and around the country, where there's lots of people gathering in small towns and cities, large and small, around the country. And that's a little bit of a concern about the coronavirus, but it's certainly, by and large, for a very good cause that we address the issue of endemic racism in this country of ours that has been a stain on our country since, well, they call it the 1619 Project, don't they, when the first slaves were brought to Jamestown. That was a year before Plymouth was settled. And by the way, it's the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims this year. But before that was Jamestown in 1603, and then in 1619, the first black Africans were brought to this continent and enslaved. And what a legacy that has been. And we're seeing the results of that legacy not being well handled by our country, as has not been the case for a long time, and we're seeing the results. But it does mean there's been great protests. There's been protests in the great city of Manchester and many other communities in the state of New Hampshire. I was hearing about one in Bristol, one in Conway, one in Keene, there, Dover. I take great comfort in this because I think one of the great freedoms we have, thanks to our First Amendment to the federal Constitution, is the right to peaceably assemble. And people are doing that to make their grievances known. And the fact that a few ne'er-do-wells who have nothing to say about the tragedy that inspired all this, but they're just up to no good, does not detract from the great and significant outpouring of good, decent Americans to say we stand against this kind of behavior we saw in Minneapolis with George Floyd. And so I just wanted to say that. And Lou, you were going to say something about the fact that there was a threatening situation in South Willow Street, and the
Yes.
city of Manchester did a great job on that.
They did. We had a wonderful event at Stock Park that went off extremely well. I'm told that they had about 1,000 people there, and it was a very peaceful, very wonderful demonstration of support for trying to make it better. I mean, make the country better. I think that was so important. South Willow Street was handled very well by our local police force. They arrested 10 people and kept everything under control. I think it was a good job done by Carlo, our chief of police in the city here of Manchester, and backed up by the National Guard and our state police. So Manchester handled it well. I think all in all, what happened in Conway, what happened in Dover, I talked to Senator Waters. He told me there were 1,000 people in Dover, and they had just a wonderful, good situation, I was telling people, I wrote I wrote a theme when we had to do these things as a freshman in college, and my theme was segregation, the threat to American democracy. That was a long time ago when I was a freshman in college.
Right.
And yet that situation has been pretty pervasive and something we got to get over. And indeed, the things that have happened. I remember the problems in California years ago, the problem in Chicago years ago, the different outbreaks, and caused nothing but bad will. And I think that the tragedy is things end up in destruction. That's the great tragedy. A good idea. Let's get out. Let's support people's rights. We talked about this on a program here not that many months ago, Bob, when we talked about the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act and how those would be impossible to pass today, given the nature of the Congress of the United States.
That's right. It's a sad comment, but I think you're absolutely right.
And yet we passed them, I believe it was 64, and
64, 65.
64, 65, and it was a great accomplishment. And I think civil rights, voting rights are so important. And I just can't tell you how important it is, because people have been discriminated against in this country for a long period of time. It's not only the African Americans, but it was the Irish, it was the Italian, it was the Polacks, right across the board. But we got to get better, and I think the things that make us better are the desire of people to make a difference, and that people have got to look up to those people, and I think our politicians have to gain credibility as doing the right thing for all of the right reasons, and that goes for our police forces and our other law enforcement people around the country. We've got to respect them, and I think we got to go back to the time when Bill Luther was captain of the Manchester Police Department, and he would tip his hat to the ladies when he walked down Elm Street. And Billy Luther was one great American. Passed away a number of years ago, but Bill Luther was the hallmark of a Manchester police officer.
I got to hand it to our chief, Chief Capano.
Capano's been
great.
Because
after they had the demonstration downtown here on Saturday, a number of them went up to Valley Street to the police headquarters, and he came down and joined them. He came down and joined them for a moment of silence. Other police chiefs have marched with the protesters, which I think is exactly what we need, because we know, and it needs to be continually reaffirmed, that most police are there to do good for all the people they serve. Most police believe in their goal to serve and to protect. That's certainly true for our Manchester police. And when a few bad apples get to do the horrible things we've seen far too often, whether it's in Ferguson or in Staten Island, with Merrick Garland, not Merrick Garland, that was the Supreme Court judge, a guy named Garland, anyhow, also said, "I can't breathe," and ended up dying. And then George Floyd, that is not the rank and file of the police that serve our country in towns and cities everywhere. But there are those people there, and they have to be brought to account.
Yeah, and again, kudos to Carlo and the Manchester Police Force, to our Commissioner of Safety, Bob Quinn, who does a great job, Colonel of our state police, Colonel Noyes, whose father actually was killed in the line of duty, just a super guy, and we're lucky. We're very, very lucky in so many ways.
Well, we're lucky in this way. We have, hey, Brad. Hey, Brad, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
We can hear you, too. And,
welcome.
We thank you so much for calling in to join us, Brad. We wish you could be here, but we understand that you're working remotely like so many of us are these days. And
we're writing an election committee report as we speak.
Well, that's what we wanted to talk about today, We were just talking about more general things, but now that you're here, we'll get right to the topic. Folks, with us on the line is Brad Cook, who's been, I think for, many, many years, Brad, you've been the chair of the Ballot Law Commission, which has been doing an essential role in our elections by deciding who's legitimately on the ballot, whether their name is properly placed on the ballot. All kinds of ballot issues end up before the Ballot Law Commission. And Brad Cook, who's a premier lawyer here in the city of Manchester, always finds a very rational and reasonable way to address those issues. Probably not to the satisfaction of everybody that comes before the Ballot Law Commission. That would be asking too much, but to the general good of making sure that our rules are enforced for make our democracy work. And now, Brad, we're worried about, and this is why I wanted to have you on, and Lou agreed it would be a good idea, as we look forward to the fact that, well, you're working remotely. We're here with very great limitations on what we're doing right here in this studio, although it's opened up a little bit. And Manchester doesn't look anything like it would look on a beautiful June evening right now, although there's some resurgence of, outdoor seating and that sort of thing. But we're worried about where this is going to be in the fall when we have our primary and then our national election. How will we be able to deal with voting, and what are some of the issues you're looking at with the commission you're leading? And so tell us what you're up to and what you're finding out.
Well, for the last, and Senator D'Alessandro, it's always good to talk to you, even
Thank
though
you, Brad.
we haven't talked yet. But, you two guys have been friends of mine for 45 years, which is a dangerous kind of thing to say to begin with.
Right.
But, so Secretary Gardner appointed a committee of 6 people, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, about 6 weeks ago, to advise him on the expenditure of the $3.2 million in CARES Act funds that the state got when he applied for it after the CARES Act passed, to help with elections affected by the virus and the pandemic. And for the last 5 weeks, we've been having public hearings, inviting everybody that we could think of, interest groups, labor unions, legislators, all kinds of folks, to the table to tell us what they're worried about and tell us what they think should happen, knowing that we had to operate within the confines of existing New Hampshire law, which had been adjusted a little bit by an opinion of the Attorney General some time ago, reinforced by a gubernatorial order, that fear of going to the polls and being in a large group setting qualified somebody to apply for an absentee ballot as disabled. And that in and of itself was a massive facilitating thing. And if you've been following the news, there's been litigation in Texas when the Attorney General in Texas refused to issue such an order. So it only makes sense that if you're afraid to get sick to go vote, then you're disabled from voting, and that's the premise on which we've been proceeding. So we've heard from literally hundreds of people. All of our meetings have been held remotely, 3 days a week for a long time. And today we voted on a draft of a final report, which I'm in the process of rewriting, that basically says, here's not only how we think the money should be spent, but here's what we learned about the election process, and here are changes that we think should be made to make it work under these conditions. And in fact, today, the Attorney General and the Secretary of State issued a new advisory on absentee registration, which clarified a lot of the issues that we've been dealing with, because when you get involved in this stuff, it's not just voting absentee. Then you peel back the onion and you find out that yesterday, the 2nd of June, was the last day to change party if you were registered in a party and you want to change your party for the primary. Today was the first day that the filing period for re-election or for election for new candidates took place. And then that gets over in a couple of weeks. And then you've got voting, and you've got who's been put on the ballot. And so ballots have to be prepared for every polling place in the state. We have 12 different ballots in Manchester, for example. So imagine how complicated that is. And we have made some determinations that weren't terribly hard to make, that the safest way to vote this year for both voters, which is important, but for poll workers operating in the polls to stay safe, is for a large number of our voters to vote absentee and take the other actions absentee. You could already file for office absentee, and that was clarified by one of the executive orders as to the last day, which used to be required to be in person. But there's a ton of stuff that's involved in this, and we've got a pretty long report that I think we're going to have pretty good consensus on, that says getting PPE equipment for poll workers so that they're safe, having it available for voters so they're safe, urging people to vote and publicizing the processes for absentee voting and making it fairly streamlined, and registration by remote means, because people have to register to vote. And in New Hampshire, in an average year, we're really lucky. We have something called same-day registration. This year, that could be a terrible clog on the system, especially in places where a lot of new voters go and try to register that day. So coordinating that, doing all the other things, has been quite a job, and it's been fascinating to learn about the system. And the other thing that we learned was how tremendously dedicated and hardworking and creative our local polling officials are, the moderators, the supervisors of the checklist, the city town clerks. I mean, these people administer the system, and they really know their business, and that's been tremendously rewarding to get their input.
Yeah. Yeah. You
Well-
still there?
Yep.
Okay.
That's what I give you a chance. I have that.
Well, you're giving us a lot of
Right, you
lot
got
to
a lot
chew
to think
over
about,
here.
Right.
Brad, the Secretary of State, who has been Secretary of State for 40 years, I guess now, has never been much of a fan of increasing the opportunity for absentee voting. He's not been a fan of no excuses absentee voting for all, much less of going all the way over to vote by mail for everybody, which I guess is the way it's now done in up to 7 states in the United States.
Yeah, which means it's the way it's not done in 43, so don't get confused.
But is your commission now ready to recommend that absentee voting be available for I don't know whether it be no excuse, but certainly is it a sufficient excuse that you have a fear of being in a place where there's a lot of people and some who may be testing positive for the virus?
Well, our commission didn't have to opine on that fact. The Attorney General and Secretary of State's guidance, reinforced by the governor's order, already said that.
Oh, it did? Okay.
We're not taking any position, Bob, on any issue, which are certainly legitimate things for people to debate. I've got my opinions on them. I think we probably have the best system in the country the way it is. But this year is different from any other year.
Yes.
And Secretary Gardner, who you're right, has been very jealous of keeping security and safe elections, and which has always had us in the last, since 1984, we've been in the top 3 or 4 states in terms of turnout in the country.
Right.
The states that went to all mail saw a precipitous drop in their participation rate. So, this myth of all mail balloting is sometimes good. I think people think they're getting junk mail and throw them out. But
Well, I have friends in the legislature from the conferences I go to from Oregon, and they say it's just not true that the voting is holding up well in Oregon, which was certainly one of the states and probably one of the first states.
Their election, their participation rate went down after they went to all mail voting. They were equal to or ahead of us for a couple of elections. After they went to all mail voting, we've beaten them every time. So, but that's not what my committee's doing. And
Okay.
It's certainly a legitimate thing for legislators to debate
Yeah.
at their leisure. We are not taking any position, regardless of personal opinions of the people on the committee, on changing any laws permanently. All we're talking about is dealing with elections in the face of the 2020 pandemic. And one of the tricks that's been interesting is we have no idea what it's going to be like in September and November. I mean,
That's
we
true.
all hope
Right.
and pray that
We-
it doesn't come
yeah.
back. But if it comes back, everybody might be home again. So we
Right,
don't
right.
know.
Yeah.
But,
And the only thing that's clear is the safest way to do it this year is to do it from home. And Bill Gardner has not only reinforced that and supported that, and in his order today talked about how you can register safely, but he's charged us with telling him how to spend the money to do it. So, the idea that he's against this is just baloney, although traditionally he's been very much in favor of limiting the number of people who could vote absentee.
So Brad, could you articulate to the audience what will be the difference in this vote in the September primary and the November election? What will differentiate this from other elections? We have the virus. That's that's the unknown that's hanging over us. But what is the new normal going to be, beginning with the primary in September and the general election in November, based on the Attorney General's opinion and the narrative that was just put out today by the Secretary of State, I guess the AG, in compliance with the governor's executive order. So let people know what is it going to be like for a voting citizen in New Hampshire for the primary in September and for the general in November.
Well, the basic difference this year from other years is that polling places are going to have to observe all of the same things that we have to observe when we go to the store, when we go to the office, when we go to church, I guess, starting next week. People have to be a certain distance from each other. only certain numbers of people can be in a confined area at the same time. There has to be social distancing. So when you used to go into your polling place and have A to C in this line, and right next to it was D to F and blah, 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 when you were signing in, those people are all going to have to be 6 feet away from each other. People in line are going to have to be 6 feet from each other. And what does that mean? That means if it weren't for absentee ballots, the thing would take forever to do it, because this is a presidential year, as we all know. And so what we're saying, what everybody's saying, is let's make it as easy as we can to vote absentee. So
Okay.
there's going to be a lot of publicity. We're contemplating a statewide mailing telling people how to do it. That's one of our recommendations. We're going to contemplate sending absentee ballot applications, or at least the way to get them to every voter or every household. And we hope and we expect, based on what's been going on in other states, that the typically 10% of our voters who vote absentee will be 50% or more this year, which does two things. It keeps people safe in their homes and able to vote, and it takes the pressure off the polling places that are still going to exist and still going to operate for the people that need to vote in person or want to vote in person, but they have to do it safely, and that's what the difference is going to be.
Boy, that'll change the way people campaign, too. If 50% of the votes may be cast before Election Day itself arrives, I mean, that's going to change the way people have to plan their campaigns, too, I guess.
Oh, I think so. I think so. And you know, when you look at Vice President Biden's campaign, he's been in his basement talking into a computer, I guess, or whatever. When normally people would be out running around the countryside.
Yeah.
So it's not only how people are going to campaign, but you know, one of the things we're saying in our report is that every organization in the state of New Hampshire that has an interest in this, primarily, of course, it's the political parties and the candidate organizations, but there are a lot of citizen organizations, the League of Women Voters, and different interest groups, and you know, conservatives and liberals and anybody else has got to get the word out on how to do this, because every citizen's got to know that absentee ballots available to them, how to get one, how to fill it out, and how to get it back. And we want to make sure that they can get it back easily, so we're recommending that the return of the absentee ballots be with prepaid postage for the first time in New Hampshire, and some of the CARES Act money be spent so that it doesn't cost people money to cast their ballot, because for most of us it doesn't matter, but for some people that might be an impediment.
Sure, that sounds really good. One of the great things we've had in New Hampshire for many, many years, and I do credit Gardner and his office for making this a priority, is the ability to have same-day registration and come to the polls and not need to bring a whole ton of documents with you. I mean, I guess you're supposed to bring something to prove you're a citizen and that you reside in the district where you're trying to vote. But, you know, even on that, they let you usually get away with signing an affidavit on at least the residency. And that's been a wonderful thing, I think. But I can really see that jamming up the process if we have to comply with all these social distancing and other requirements to avoid transmission of the virus. So have you got a recommendation about that? Will there still be same-day registration at the polls? But what are you recommending to take the pressure off of those long lines for that purpose?
Well, there'll still be same-day registration at the polls. We just hope it won't be used much.
Yeah.
Because this guidance that came out, it wasn't an order, but this guidance that came out from the AG and the Secretary of State today talks about how to register by mail. Now, it's always been possible to register by mail. It's just most people didn't need to because of same-day registration.
Yeah.
But if you ask for an absentee ballot, and the clerk, or the supervisor of the checklist, or the city clerk, or whoever does the comparing, looks at the checklist and sees that you're not a registered voter, they not only send you a ballot, they send you a registration packet so you can register to vote.
I see.
And send them all in together.
Okay.
And so, and that's a little known fact because it wasn't necessary
Right.
in New Hampshire. I mean, New Hampshire's been way ahead. I've always been amused by these people that say, you know, how hard it is for college students to register. If they lived in New York City, they'd have to figure out what office to go to 6 weeks before the election to get registered, or they wouldn't be able to register. In New Hampshire, they can walk in on the same day and register.
Yeah.
But yes, we have recommendations on the subject, but I think what was issued today takes care of a lot of the questions about it.
Okay, good.
So, Brad, what kind of a campaign, a public awareness campaign, will there be to articulate all of the things that you have just mentioned? Will there be money set aside from the money given by the federal government in order to do this? Will there be PSAs on radio and television? I mean, this is a big deal. This is different. People are looking at something they haven't done before for many years.
No question, Lou. No question about it. One of the things, as I just mentioned, we're recommending a statewide mailing to every household in the state, with clear instructions to people on how they can vote this year safely.
Okay.
And then we're recommending both free and paid publicity to the extent. I mean, we only have $3.2 million to allocate, and we've had enough suggestions to probably spend 10 times that much money. So,
Sure.
So we've only got X amount of dough, but we've suggested that that the public officials go on the air, that they seek to get free media, that they put out press releases, which they do regularly. I mean, if you go to the Secretary of State's website, which is being redesigned continuously, you get a heck of a lot of information. You see how to vote in the COVID-19 time, blah, blah, blah. We're suggesting that a hotline be established at the Secretary of State's office with some knowledgeable state official giving the word to everybody that the website give consistent information, but that, all the free media and all the paid media that can be afforded within the context be available.
Yeah.
Well,
So you've got $3.2 million to do all of this. What are some of the what's the priority in terms of how you're spending the funds? I guess probably number one is going to be just what Lou was talking about, education about these changes, right?
Well, no. Number one is administering the process, because of course the federal government gives you money and then they ask you to account for it in almost no time at all.
Yeah.
While you're doing recounts and while you're doing everything else. So the Secretary of State's hiring an accounting firm to comply with the accounting principles, so it doesn't get hit with some kind of penalty. So that's, but that's not a huge amount of the $3.2 million.
Yeah.
Then our second priority is the PPE for polling officials,
Yep.
so that they're safe when they go out to work in the polling places. And then prepaid postage and publicity and some of the other things I mentioned are, they're all important, but the safety items are the most important.
Yeah. Will PPE be available for the voters that come to the polls, or are they expected to come in wearing a mask, or will they be allowed to in without a mask, or what?
That's a fascinating subject, because obviously we're going to ask people to come to the polls with masks on and to be safe and to observe the stuff. The question is, people have a constitutional right to vote. And so somebody comes in who doesn't believe in COVID-19 and thinks that the government shouldn't be messing with his life and all this other stuff, and shows up and doesn't have a mask on. What do you do with that person? And we've got a section on some suggested remedies for that, in terms of, because I don't think, if Hannaford's won't let you into the store because you don't have a mask on, that's a private business. If the city of Manchester or the town of Bedford or town of Goffstown says you can't vote if you don't have a mask on, and I don't want to have a mask on, have they just violated my constitutional right? I don't want to find out the answer to that.
Yeah.
So we've got some suggestions on how to handle it, like here's a mask for you to wear, so have some PPE available for the voters. But the guy or one lady that says I'm not doing it creates an interesting dilemma. We have people on the committee who say, well, so tell them they can't vote if they won't follow the rules. Well, I'm not terribly comfortable with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
I think the big thing, Brad, will be getting this information out to the public. The legislature will be in session twice, I believe, before it ends its session. The House
That's
on the
right.
11th, The Senate, I believe, will be after that, and I think we'll both meet on the 30th.
That's my understanding.
Okay, and we'll end the session. So everyone is campaigning for re-election. You got a senatorial election, a presidential election, a gubernatorial election, and then right down the ballot. So there has to be a consistent message about how you vote. And
Well, one of the advantages in New Hampshire is we have, let's see, 424 plus 5 plus 2 plus 2 plus 1 sources of income, sources of information, because that's, well, and it's not 424, it's probably 848 little advertising agencies that are going to be telling voters how to do this. So, you know, it's
That's true.
but you're right. Getting the word out is critical. And
Yeah.
frankly, one of the things in our report is saying that, you know, either some of our recommendations require a change in the law that has not yet been covered by an executive order.
I was wondering
And
about
so-
that. Yeah. So
We're very blessed on this committee to have a guy that you work with, Lou, all the time, Tom Sherman from Rye,
yes,
who's, you know, I never met or knew anything about until this committee started, and I got to say, it's been worth the price of admission, because he's, you know, not only is he a doctor, but he's a national expert on PPE. He and his niece from MIT
yes,
spearheaded the effort to bring in stuff from China that Dean Kamen adopted and did, but he and his niece designed it. And, you know, this guy is something special, and I'm sure you know that. But,
Yes.
you know, and he's really taken the lead in designing a lot of this safety stuff for us, and you know, what a fine man.
well, that's it.
Hey, I'll tell you how special he is, Brad. If you hadn't been available tonight, we were going to call him next.
He was second in line, Brad.
He got 3 jobs. You know, he has a day job called
Right.
a doctor. He's a state senator that just started working again. He was up till midnight last night writing a section of this report, and then was on the phone with me this morning. So, you know, just let the old lawyer do it, not the smart young doctor.
Well, I think, Brad, that what comes out of your committee has to be spread to the entire state. And as you say, there are 400 members in the House, 24 members in the Senate, and a variety of others that have to spread the word. My concern is about consistency, that we're all on the same page in giving our narrative about what is the process that will be in place in order to vote. I think people are very concerned about that, from what I hear. And I was on a call with Dr. Sherman this morning, and Melanie Levesque is very interested in this. Obviously, a woman senator from the Brookline area, and all very concerned about this and about the legislation that's required to make all of it happen. And you said there were some changes required, and I think that they're being worked out as we speak, and they'll be handled when the House and Senate come back into session.
Well, I hope the legislature has it. I mean, what we've recommended, because we don't want to tackle any of these issues on the forever basis, but
Right.
what we've suggested, and we're not legislators, and we only can make recommendations, but what we've suggested is that to the extent that changes need to be made in legislation that can't be made by executive order, or perhaps they should be put in legislation anyway in case somebody challenges an executive order as being beyond the authority of the governor or some such thing, be 2020 only rules that sunset a week after the November election. And so, you know, fix it for 2020 and then take up any other reforms you want later. But I'm a little worried, Lou, and you know better than I, about this effort by my party, if you'll pardon the expression, to not extend the deadlines for the legislature so that nothing can happen, because
Right.
you know, we really need some help here.
Yeah.
There's no question. And,
Yeah. Unless that changes, Brad, we're going to be able to get absolutely nothing done.
But, yeah, and that, you know, some days I think that's a good thing for the legislature to get nothing done, but in this particular case, I think, we may need some help here.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, if you're looking for legislative action to help out with this year's election, I don't think we can be very optimistic about that, given where we're at. And as I'm sure you know, Brad, the basic problem is we are coming back on the 11th, as Lou said, and again on the 30th. So we're going to have 2 sessions. But in fact, all our deadlines for acting on bills have passed. So in order to act on bills, we have to have an agreement to suspend the rules. That takes a 2/3 vote of those present voting. And we have a strong majority of the Democrats in both chambers, but we don't have a 2/3. So if the
Well, I
Republicans,
understand that. No.
so if the
I
Republicans
understand
stick to
that,
this
but,
thing, we won't be able
one
to
of the-
tackle any of this
One
stuff.
of the things about our report is it's, we've got the former Republican chair of the House Elections Committee on our committee, Barbara Griffin from Goffstown.
Yes,
Right.
And she's been very responsible and very helpful.
good.
And we, on a bipartisan basis, may need some stuff to make it easier for everybody to vote. I mean, this, and I've said this before, and I when I first time I said it, I thought I was being overly dramatic. And the more I've been thinking about this process, if the state of New Hampshire and 49 other states don't get this right, and the election and the voters, forget the election, the voters are not able to make the same kind of decision they would have made, whatever that decision is, without the coronavirus around, that could very well alter the future of the world. And
Yeah.
No
that's
question.
not an understatement.
No
and that's
question.
pretty scary stuff.
It sure is. And that,
I mean, this election, I think, is so important that we pull this off. Frankly,
Yes.
I think it's really important that we have this election and we have a very clear result. I hope it's an overwhelming result myself. But in any event, I hope there's no chance for anybody like the President of the United States to claim it's fraudulent and not accept the results. I mean, everything that you're doing, I think, is going to help not have that be the result, but it's a real concern out there. We all share. I think we share. Probably not everybody shares, but I think it's a real concern.
Oh, I think it is. We
Well,
don't.
and the rumors of
Oh,
opposition to, I don't know why anybody in the world thinks that if people vote by mail, it's going to be one way or the other.
Yeah.
But the president and the Republican National Committee, as reported, I don't know that this is true, but I've seen reports, apparently have a lot of a war chest set aside to just fight people voting by mail.
Yeah.
So that means either they don't want people to vote, or they want people to be unsafe. And I can't believe, I don't think that's true in New Hampshire, because I've seen no evidence of it from anybody in New Hampshire. We
Well,
had the
that's
chairman
good.
of the Republican Party testify
Yeah.
right at the same time that the chairman of the Democratic Party testified. And we've got 3 Republicans on this committee and 3 Democrats, and we've heard nothing of people shouldn't be able to vote and vote safely. So, but there are places, apparently, in this country where there may be efforts to have people go to court and try to fight, safe voting in the age of Corona-19, and
Right.
that, frankly, I find to be disgusting.
right.
Absolutely.
Well, it's something we have to face up to. We have to recognize that this is not normal. We're in a new normal. There are going to be some new rules in place. If we articulate them clearly and succinctly, people will adhere to those rules. I think the population usually does that. New Hampshire's had a history of doing that. And I think as long as the word gets out there and it's clear, we're going to be in good shape in New Hampshire. It's as that first in the nation, with that great status that we've had for a long period of time. We always have good voter turnout. Our elections are done fairly, without a great deal of problems, and we've got to do it again this time. But it's not going to be normal. People have to pay attention. They have to abide by the rules, and the rules are made to make them safe and to make it easier for them to participate in the process. And it seems to me that's a good message to convey.
Yep.
Absolutely. But there's a lot of optimism in this process. I mean, when I started in this committee, not only did I meet some nice people, one of our members, Kathy Seaver, was the town clerk in Farmington, New Hampshire for 41 years. And my mother's stepmother and 2 half-brother and sister lived in Farmington. And the first day I was on the phone with Kathy, I said, you know, I know something about Farmington. My mother's stepmother and my half aunt and uncle lived there, and her mother was there, who's 90 years old or thereabouts, and said, oh, yeah. And I said, she said, well, what was her name? I said, Bunny Brown. And they said, her mother said, no, it wasn't. It was Bunny Eastman, which is my middle name. And, you know, so you make, this is a small state, but one of the things we've learned is how, and I said this before, is how creative and inventive the local election officials are. I was riding down the main street in New London. I've been working remotely from New London since this whole thing started. And I was driving down the main street yesterday, and there were a bunch of cars outside the town offices because it was the last day to change parties, and the supervisors and the checklist were letting people drive up, register, or change their party without getting out of their car. Now, that's the kind of, in the local little publications up here, they've had ads about what you can do, how you can do it, where you should contact, from all the little town clerks in these little towns around here. And these people, you know, these people take it seriously. And that's a real reason for optimism. And also, you know, you read our report and it sounds like the average voter doesn't care because we say so much about making it easy for them. Well, the average voter does care, but we just can't make the process defeat them. We got to give them a level playing field. But I mean, our officials are good, our voters are good, and you know, the more I've heard, and we've had up to 450 people from the public on our Zoom calls when we've had these hearings. Most of them are town clerks and supervisors of the checklist and moderators because they want to know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
One of the great advantages of this process has been to talk about it for a month so people keep listening and talking about it and coming up with new ideas.
Yeah.
Yep.
So your draft is just now completed, I guess, huh?
Well, it will be by midnight.
Okay, you're pulling a long night, huh?
Right.
And do you expect
I
this?
just got a ton of stuff from Gene Van Loon and Kate Hanna, so, you know, and they're a couple of smart lawyers, but they, you know, they could be more concise, let's put it that way.
And do you suspect that this draft will be pretty much the same as the final report, and or is there another process to go through of getting more input before you get to a final?
Today, we had in fact, if you look at the Secretary of State's website, you can find the draft report, which we went through in great detail for 3 hours today and voted on a lot of elements and rewrote a lot of stuff. I hope tomorrow, with very few changes, we're going to vote on the final edition. It may not be have page numbers on it yet. It may not have indentation for all the sections in exactly the same way, but I think the substance is going to be, I hope, done tomorrow because, you know, we can't screw around with this too long. The electoral calendar is already in play.
That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm. And do you anticipate a unanimous vote of your commission on this?
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
That's very good.
Now,
well,
there may be a couple of people who said I didn't agree with paragraph 6 on page 13, but you know, in terms of the whole report, I think we've got very good consensus. I mean, we got some people more enthusiastic about some parts of it than others, but this has not been a partisan effort any more than usually when we have ballot law commission meetings. People say I have to vote this way because I'm a Republican, or I have to vote this way because I'm a Democrat. That's not how we operate in New Hampshire, I hope.
Yeah, I hope not too.
Right.
And the Secretary of State's office is fine with this draft, as far as you know.
Haven't asked them.
Okay.
Well,
yeah.
Now, we've been supporting, that's sort of a wise guy answer, but Bill Gardner's been very careful to answer questions when we ask them, but not try to dictate a result.
I see, sure. Okay, well,
he
that's
wouldn't have appointed a committee to advise him on this thing and go through this whole rigmarole if he wanted to hand us a report, because he didn't have to do this. He could have just said, I got $3.2 million and this is how I'm going to spend it.
True.
He didn't do that.
Yeah, well, that's good. I think it sounds like you got a wonderful group there, and I certainly know the ones you mentioned and admire them, as of course I do you from the many years you put in serving the public here, particularly on election matters. So you're the obvious guy to be the leader of a very good crew, I think, and I'm glad that you got this far. It sounds like we have you at a very timely point here.
Right, a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and tomorrow will be the day.
My wife says, if we're working at home, how come I haven't seen you for 6 weeks?
Well, the old expression, you want
Right.
something done, give it to a busy man.
Right, that's for sure. That's for sure. Yeah, well, we can't thank you enough for all of
We
your hard
can't
work.
thank you enough for the hard work you've done on this and on the Ballot Law Commission for all the years you've chaired that. And, voting is central to democracy, and you're central to our voting system, it seems like.
Well, I got to give Bill Gardner credit. He has been Secretary of State since 1976 or whenever it was.
Yeah.
Right, he's
And
been
his story of getting elected against Arthur Drake, and Lou will remember. You probably both remember Arthur, but
I do.
Arthur was the candidate of the Republican Party. He just forgot to ask the voters because he figured it was a Republican job. And young Bill Gardner went out and asked everybody,
Right.
and kept the job, and he's had it for all these years, and he hasn't done it by being stupid.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Well, that's for sure. And Arthur Drake was a great human being. Arthur Drake was
Oh,
chairman
he
of
was. He was a great guy.
he was chairman of appropriations when I first came to the legislature. Drake's Dry Goods in Lancaster, New Hampshire.
Yep.
And just a wonderful public servant. Wonderful public
Oh,
servant.
yeah, he was a nice guy, and he
Yep.
served the state well after that.
He
But-
did.
But one of the great rules in politics, remember what Tip O'Neill said when
Right.
the lady next door didn't vote for him? You never asked me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You
Yeah.
got to ask. That's
You gotta
for sure.
ask, that's
You
right.
got to ask. Don't leave no stone unturned in this business. I'll tell you that. But,
Well, I think you've learned that. I think you've learned that a couple of times.
I have. I think I've learned it a number of times, Brad. But I've been fortunate to have good friends like you, and of course the late great Kim Zakis, who was at your law firm and who was one of my mentors and a wonderful guy, and Bill Green.
And mine too.
Right.
But
Yeah.
so the public should know this. The first week that I was a summer clerk at Sheehan Finney Bassin Green, which was 48 years ago, a guy came in to see me named Lou D'Alessandro, who I'd never heard of, didn't know anything about, and he just wanted to meet me because somebody my mother worked for and had been a teacher of mine, knew him, and told him I was working in Manchester, and that's the kind of guy Lou D'Alessandro.
Well, thanks. Well, it was a fortuitous meeting for me, so thank you, Brad. Thank you. And again, we can't thank you enough for the work that's been done. And I must say this, everyone who's running for public office should be talking about getting out to vote, following the rules. The rules are being constructed for your safety and for your ability to do one of the most important things you do as an individual, and that's vote, because your vote counts.
Well, and even the people who are going to be disappointed because they don't come in first can do a huge public service this year by getting the message out to their supporters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like your phrase that there was about 800-person
Right.
advertising campaign going here for these changes because people were going to want people to vote for them.
I got the best advertising posse that anybody ever had in the New Hampshire legislature.
Right. How true. How true.
Well, all I can say, Brad, is talk to your friends in your party and see if they can't persuade the Republican leadership in the House to withdraw their threat to stymie our upcoming sessions from advancing legislation. I really hope that doesn't happen, but it seems like a very real threat right now. And, it's nice to go over to the Whittemore Center, which is where we're going to meet, and learn how to vote over there instead of at the State House. But we want to be able to vote on things that are going to make a difference. And
Don't slip on the ice. But
don't slip on the ice. And who's going to throw a fish on the ice after we have our first vote? I don't know.
Right. It'll be interesting.
But anyway, okay. Well, thanks very much. And
Thank you, Brad. Our best to your family.
And the best to you.
Thank you. Thank you, fellas. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time. Take care.
Yeah.
Well,
Bye-bye.
I think a really good articulation of what's been going on.
I didn't know we were hitting this at such an opportune time. They just
perfect.
finishing the
Right,
draft
finishing
tonight
it, right.
of how we're going to spend $3.2 million
$2
to
right.
make sure our elections go forward in a fair and free fashion, and a perceived to be fair and free fashion.
Yes.
That's the important
Right.
thing. They have to not be fair and free. They have to be perceived to be fair and
Right,
free.
right.
And we couldn't have a better team. It sounds like I don't know who the members of that team are, other than the ones he mentioned. But the ones he mentioned, I certainly think are admirable individuals.
Yes.
And
they're Republicans and Democrats.
and Democrats, and that's very important.
That's very important. It's very
Yeah,
clear.
we should agree on this. We should agree. It seems to me distressing that there's so much activity in in attempting to suppress the vote.
Yeah, it's
And gerrymander and suppression, which gerrymandering is a form of suppression of the vote.
yeah,
And
yes.
that's a really bad thing. And both parties should be able to agree we want eligible people to vote and to exercise that right.
Sure.
It's the lifeblood of democracy.
Sure, and we should have independent individuals drawing the lines.
We definitely should.
That
That was the
something that
worst
should-
veto of the governor's. The last
think it was,
57 vetoes of the
right.
last term was we had voted for an independent
Right,
redistricting commission. Take it out of the way from both
Right.
parties. Let people just look at the census data and figure out what's the best way to give everybody an equally good vote. And the governor vetoed that. That's the one I'm more upset about that veto than the ones he vetoed of our energy legislation,
Well, I
which is
think
of course
that,
particularly important to me because of my committee chairmanship.
Of course, well that one.
But that is the worst. That was just awful.
well, because it didn't make any sense.
It didn't make any sense,
It just didn't make any sense, and the gerrymandering that's taken place it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
Look at the executive council districts.
Yeah.
And I served on that council years and years ago, and the gerrymandering is really quite unbelievable. And
It
some of the
certainly
house
is.
districts also.
Some of the house districts, yeah, it's a real problem.
Yeah, it
The
is.
fact is that for the Democratic Party to win a majority of the seats in the House, and I guess it's true in the Senate, they have to win more than 50% plus one of the votes.
Yeah.
You have to win like 53 or 54%. And that's not right. I mean, it should not be that way. It should be the House, the body that gets the most votes should get the majority. The party of the body that gets the most votes should get to be in the majority. And it's not true.
And that should be nationwide.
And it should be nationwide,
And-
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
when you look at what's happened over the years, if you're an incumbent at the national level, 80% of the time you get reelected because of
Yep.
the way the district's been configured. That's not a good thing.
Yeah, that's right.
We
That's
we need activity, we need ideas, but we also need people to know that their vote counts. And in some of those redistricting situations, people say, "I'm not going to vote because my vote doesn't count."
Yeah, that's
And
right.
That's a
That's
terrible situation to be in. But indeed, we do have a situation, Bob, that's different. It's going to be different, and for the first time in my lifetime and your lifetime, going to the polls, it's going to be different. It's going to be different, and the standing in line, the chatting in line that we used to
Yeah.
get so much used to, that's not going to be the case.
Yeah.
And the fear of the virus is pervasive.
Yeah.
And God knows what's happening on a daily basis in New Hampshire. We get these reports about people who are passing, and over 100,000 people in this country have passed away
That's right.
because of the virus, and
Yeah.
that in itself is a real tragedy. And when you look at the age cohort, 60 and over represent about 80% of the passings.
Yeah.
And now there seems to be some movement towards younger age cohorts, and that again is even more tragic.
Yeah,
when
that's
you
even more
think of it.
tragic.
So we gotta,
I certainly agree. Yeah.
so we've
You know, I
gotta-
remember watching the voting they had in Wisconsin a few weeks ago on a Tuesday in May, and I think it was in May, and the governor wanted to postpone the election, and they elect their judges in Wisconsin. And they had a
Yes,
Republican
yes, right.
majority in the Supreme Court,
Right.
and the Supreme Court said, no,
Yeah.
you've got to vote. And so it was really distressing to see people, trying to line up and vote wearing masks, because they hadn't had a commission like the one Brad Cook is doing, where you had months to prepare and spend money to try and make the adjustments. They just had to risk their health to go vote. And you shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to risk your health to exercise a constitutional right. I just thought that was absolutely dreadful, but that happened in the state of Wisconsin.
Right.
And I'm afraid it's going to happen in other states too as we go forward. But it sounds like we're doing things well in New Hampshire, and
Yeah, we're moving
I
in
have
the
to
right
say, under
direction.
Secretary Gardner, we've maintained a reputation for, good access for people to
Yes.
the polls, same-day registration, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
a wonderful thing, and And there's never been really much of a question about the results. If there is, you can ask a recount.
Right.
But those recounts, they only change it just a few votes.
yeah,
I mean,
just
the
a few,
votes are
very
pretty
few,
good.
right.
Sometimes it changes the result because the result's very close.
Right,
But
right.
most often it doesn't, you
Right.
know? Most often it just says, well, yeah, we got
Oh,
this
yeah.
right.
I think Bill has done a terrific job as Secretary of State. And I was here when Bob Stock was our Secretary of State.
I remember him. He was a
Who was
Goffstown guy.
Goffstown guy, another great guy, and ran a wonderful office. And Bill has followed in that tradition. And you got those women that work in that office who are just outstanding. Paula and Karen and that family.
Yeah.
They are in there day in and day out working for the people of the state of New Hampshire and doing a remarkable job. So I couldn't be more effusive in my praise of the way they run that office.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just it's
My only
quality.
problem, Lou, with Bill was when he decided to join that presidential election commission chaired by that guy, Chris Kobach. I know he was doing it with the best of intentions. I know he thought he could diffuse that and turn it into something that would not be acclaimed by the president of mass voter fraud, including here in New Hampshire. I know that's what he wanted to do, but to me it just didn't sit well. That Chris Kobach was the #1 vote suppressor in the country as the Secretary of State in Kansas. So that bothered me.
Well,
But in any event,
we all have our
you know,
we all have our ups
we
and
all
downs,
make
right?
decisions that we may regret. I don't know whether
Right.
Bill actually regrets that
Right.
decision, but I think it was an unwise thing to do.
Well,
But
I've
all
been-
praise to him for what he's done
Right.
for, as you say, 40 years of taking care of
Of
our
hard
elections,
work, right.
defending our primary ably, and people love to come here to participate in it because they know it's going to
Well,
be a
they-
fair and open
right.
process.
It's something that people, as you said, people from all over the country come here every 4 years to witness a presidential primary.
All over the world.
All over the world. And it's a great
You've talked
event.
to reporters from all over the
I
world
do.
about this, and I have
We've
too.
been very lucky in that respect. And
Yeah.
this will be another very important election, but it'll be run properly. We'll get the vote out like we should get the vote out. Just pay attention to all of the information that's going to be disseminated out of the office of the Secretary of State. I believe the League of Women Voters, everybody will be pushing out this information. Just pay attention, follow the rules, and everything will work out as it usually does.
Let's
We
vote.
make
Let's
it
vote.
happen.
Let's have the highest voting total in the country this year.
well,
That's
we-
something to
we,
be really proud of.
We live in hope. That's the name of the game.
So Lou, thanks for coming in and
Oh,
joining
thank
us.
you, Bob.
Always a
It's,
pleasure.
my
And
pleasure.
I want to thank Brad. I don't know if he's able to see us out there. Probably not. But I just want to thank him for coming in. It was kind of late notice on Brad. We'd hope to have the Secretary of
I
State.
can still hear you, Bob.
Oh, great. Thank you, Brad.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us on the
Yeah,
phone,
thank
Brad.
you.
That was terrific.
Yeah.
And we really
It was a
appreciate it.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care. Good night, everybody. I'll be back next week with Mike Farley for another edition of the Progress Report, and look forward to being with you, and maybe we'll have some time on the line for other callers next week. I notice we only got one phone here now. We used to have two. Anyway, good night, folks. Take
Good night,
care.
everybody.